Yeah, I guess as I was thinking about this thing, it's pretty amazing with everything that we're dealing with now in education and seeing the ramifications of so many different aspects of class and race and school and community that we are so far away from Brown versus Board, but so close to some of the dynamics that created that need. And was that a part of your thinking when you decided, Doc, to really delve deeper into this issue?
Well, yes, and I think your observation is definitely relevant today when you think of the historical context of Brown v. Board. That really began in South Carolina with Briggs versus Elliott. Because remember that Brown v. Board that challenged school segregation, basically saying that it was unconstitutional to have separate schools, and that Brown was a Supreme Court decision that outlawed segregation in schools. But that's the end of the story for the court case. The court case began right here where we sit in South Carolina. It took several years to reach the ultimate Supreme Court case in 1954, but you have to go back to 1948, 1950, and look at what was going on in education in South Carolina, where a small rural community in Clarendon County among families that realized that they were not getting a quality education or one that was supported by resources, and challenged the system in that rural community. But so it's hard to think of Brown versus Board in '54 and date it back to 1949, 50 in terms of where it began. But it really is that rural community in South Carolina.
Yeah, and so knowing what we all know, what do you all think are the implications of Brown v. Board to where we are today, where our kids sit in our school systems now? What's the implications of Brown v. Board to where we see our schools today?
Well, part of it is, especially in the middle of a pandemic where student achievement is being impacted. And it's greatly exacerbated among underserved communities and under-resourced communities, where teachers are challenged with finding ways to reach students, to raise their student achievement level, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And now the difference is that we're sitting in really contemporary schools, brick buildings, and it's hard to think that we're under-resourced in 2022, but in fact, when you compare it to 1948, where you're talking about in Clarendon County, where the highest achievement level for education was 5th grade, especially among the Black community in Clarendon County. So, but to the question is that the system is still challenged with parity. And you hear it all the time, where there's this resources not being spread equally among school systems, and you still have those that are underachieving. And you've talked about South Carolina, those that were underachieving before the pandemic, and is still underachieving.
I think for me, it's pretty succinct. It's that old adage that those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. And in 2022, it's pretty frightful for me to see so much separatism, so much willful, voluntary segregation. And it makes you wonder, like, how did we get back here from that time?
Yeah.
And that's probably the scariest thing, is that we look like we're repeating history, in a not so positive way, especially if you think of, and we lose sight of the fact that it's the children it's the youth that are being impacted the most at a time where education is not seen as, though in one sense it's important, everyone recognizes education is important, but you have fewer students coming out of our K-12 system choosing to teach. That's why our colleges are seeing under-enrollment in their teacher education programs. And worse, many programs are shutting down their teacher education program. So again, 2022, feels more like 1922 in that regard. But context is important. And how do we move forward from here?
And again, and I think that's why this is so critical, for the university to really take full charge and really bring this story to light. Again, so we can really find ourselves learning from the history and being able in a position to move forward. And this time in 2022, we can move forward collectively. So I think that's why I think this day and time to really tell these stories is so critical.
And the sacrifice that was the commitment made by a community to learn. When you date it back to the 1940s, it was recognized that there was not a lot of people had a formal education, and we think of the 1940s like it was 100 years ago, and for many of us, it's still within our lifetime. That there were communities and families that didn't get past the 5th grade, and there were schools that they had to walk to that didn't look like the structures today. They were hand built in wooden structures, but there was a fight to learn, and the sacrifice is what that history tells me that the families endured back 75 years ago. They were willing to sacrifice all. And that's what we should never forget about that community that really led us to ultimately the desegregation of schools.
And I know that you all, both of you actually, spend a lot of time in that community, a lot of times on 26, we went back and forth. What did you learn as you all were going back in the shadows of yesterday?
Wow, that's a loaded question. I think there were so many valuable lessons. Being on the road, the 26 up and down the interstate. But I think one of the things that stood out to me, as Dr. Jones just reiterated, was the importance of community. How when we talk about and when we look at education and what education means, the community valued education. And because the community placed a significant value on education, they were willing to do whatever they needed to do for the sake of their children. Again, it wasn't about grandstanding for them or making a name for them, or they didn't position themselves to say, one day I'll go down in history as one of the greatest. That wasn't how they moved. They moved from a place of what we all understand as servant leadership, pure servant leadership. But it was about the greater good of their students, of their children, and everyone in the community. They were willing to, again, move forward and try to get things moved forward so everyone in the community could progress. That was something that a theme that constantly resonated. Whether you're on one side of the county to the other side of the county, it was about their children. And even hearing the stories from individuals that's still living, it was about a community, it was about education. And so that was one aspect of many lessons that really stood out to me.
And the primary goal, it was interesting and it's often confusing, was not to integrate. So keep in mind in the 1940s, there were Negro schools and there were white schools. And in fact, in Clarendon, there were 60 black schools or schools for black children and just about 12 for white children. And so, but the challenge was not to, because everybody was kind of satisfied or comfortable and accepted the norm of the day, that segregation was in fact the law. in South Carolina. So it wasn't that. It was, how can we at least give our children the chance to learn with better books? In fact, it was even more fundamental than that. When we think about today, it's just kind of hard to imagine, again, within a lifetime, that you had children that had a hard time getting to school. They weren't going to school 180 days. Right. They were only going to school just days and weeks at a time during a whole academic year, as we see it as an academic year, and they were walking to school. So transportation just to get to the schoolhouse was a challenge. So the learning loss that we talk about today, learning loss, today is almost hard to imagine how learning loss impacted a child back in 1945. And so the sacrifice that Mr. Joseph was talking about in community commitment was definitely something we learned about the value of the sacrifice. And we're talking about pretty significant sacrifice. We're talking about people who had, when it got to a point and it was clear that it was more than just supporting segregated schools, but that there was going to be a crossover to integrate the school, South Carolina fought that, but fought it in an interesting way. They fought it to protect against integration by actually raising money to build better schools for Negro children. And that's, we see some of those buildings still standing today. So it wasn't the objective to integrate. The objective on the Black community side was to improve transportation, to improve the quality of the education where they were, and yet allow the schools to continue to be separate. So it's an interesting history, and we can talk more about that, but that was a lesson, that the sacrifice, in fact, to the extent that people lost their jobs, people were threatened, people died. In fact, when you think about Reverend Delane, Reverend Delane, his family, he was a leader in the movement, and his house burned down. They burned down his house, and you see pictures of his house in Somerton, South Carolina, burned out, standing with his wife and his three children at the time. And that's the kind of sacrifice we're talking about. Yes, go ahead.
One of the things I will add, you talking about lessons learned, is just, here's an image of Reverity Wells, again, of a student who was willing to really fight for that quality of education. And when we're talking about this movement and how this movement actually started and how it initiated, it sparked from the community, but it also sparked from young people, the voices of young people within that community. So again, it wasn't just a group of older individuals, feeling like they are fighting for the rights of their children. The young people, the youth participated because they felt like my voice is just as important. My role is just as important in this fight, in this movement. And so the story of Reverity Wells, again, is a powerful story in itself. But again, it also shows that young people were a natural part of this movement.
Absolutely. That is such a incredibly profound example that young people, youth, often led the movement. In fact, Reverity Wells, being the president of the student government at Scotch Branch High School back in 1949, was represented his classmates to improve conditions at Scotch Branch High School, and fought for that. And he was principled, displayed tremendous leadership, but also commitment to the extent that he was not going to be moved or dissuaded from fighting for what was right. Reverity Wells is lost in history in this movement, in the whole movement in Clarendon County, that we believe is an example that We need to always understand how young people always was at the forefront, the vanguard of social movements. So as we again think about the movement in the last few years, led by young people, it really has a legacy that dates back generations. And in South Carolina, we have great examples. And Reverity Wells stands out as one of those examples that led the ground, was part of the groundwork that led ultimately to the court case in Clarendon County.
And you all reference, specifically you, Doc, the busing. And I know that busing had a role. When we think about busing, we always think about Montgomery, right? The boycotts, and certainly that has its place in history. But busing was at the center of this issue. Can you speak more to the role of busing and what it played in the early beginnings of this historical situation?
Sure, and thanks for raising that point, because oftentimes the Briggs versus Elliott case gets confused with the bus case. There were actually several cases, and the first case was the Pearson case versus Clarendon, I think District 22, where Levi Pearson was actually the plaintiff that fought for challenging the school district at the time to provide a bus, just a bus, not buses, a bus for transporting children in Clarendon County to a school. That's where it started, and that came in 1948, I believe. So you're looking at 6 years before Brown. That was the actual bus case. That bus case was actually thrown out. It got to court, but it was thrown out for technicality, which brings about another part, a dimension to the whole movement, especially starting with the buses, is that the NAACP lawyers at the time, Harold Boulware was the South Carolina lawyer that represented Mr. Pearson in South Carolina at the time that the case didn't really happen. So you got a case that was focused on a bus that got thrown out, but the families at the time were so committed to making this change, to making this difference, they stayed with it. That's how Reverity Wells continued to fight in Scotch Branch. That's how he rallied the community, got the community rallied, and that led to the first Briggs versus Elliott case. So that was the first case, and that case was about the equalization of the school. So the bus case got thrown out. The first Briggs case talks about equalization, not integration, equalization. And that was fought for a couple of years, taken on by, that's where Thurgood Marshall entered the picture and got petitioners to be committed to fighting the equalization case. So we have the famed civil rights NAACP attorney, ultimately the first African American to be appointed to the United States Supreme Court, was actually represented the Clarendon County community in the Briggs versus Elliott case, which, again, looking at the evolution of this, it's interesting to understand how committed, so many people were to stay the course for years, fighting this battle that from turn to turn looked like it wasn't going to happen, because you had a state, you had a community that objected, to providing the bus, providing the schools, and ultimately providing an integrated education for the community in Clarendon. There's one insertion, though, that I don't want to overlook on that last part, is Judge Waddy's Waring. The Briggs-Elliott case doesn't happen without the inspiration motivated by Judge Waring. And because Judge Waring is a white judge that come from privilege out of Charleston, with Confederate roots, it again is just a profound example of how this transformation occurred, and not disconnected from a white judge that really made this happen. And that can't go unnoticed.
So we revisited some of that history, and but there is a figure that has a pivotal role and stands out for many reasons when you think about the social historical context of the times and his background and his role. And of course, I'm speaking of Judge Waring. Can you speak to the role that he played in allowing all of this to transpire? Oh,
absolutely. Judge Waring is huge when it comes to this. There's so much detail, but in summary, to understand how important he was. One, everything, as we even say it today, is about relationships. So Judge Waring had a relationship with the people in Charleston, where he presided as a federal judge, and even his journey to become a federal judge at the tail end of his career is important to understand. But that's a story for a different day. But Judge Waring served as a federal judge, of one of the 3 federal judges that actually heard the first Briggs case, because the Briggs case actually failed in South Carolina. So understand that Briggs did not win in South Carolina. Judge Waring's dissent, when the Briggs case was brought to the federal court in Charleston, was actually the foundational argument that ultimately the Supreme Court used in arguing, and the NAACP used in arguing the Brown versus Board of Education case. But Judge Waring convinced, as the story goes, Thurgood Marshall, who was really being successful in winning cases all around the country for against discrimination. And there were important cases. So he was kind of, really a rising star, but always came short to actually challenging discrimination being unconstitutional and challenging the whole notion that segregation was unconstitutional based on the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. Well, Judge Waring convinced Thurgood Marshall to not just argue the equalization case, school equalization in South Carolina, but to actually challenge segregation itself based on the United States Constitution. Thurgood Marshall was shocked because he understood how much of an uphill climb that would have been, because you're talking about not just a Clarendon County case, you're now talking about a case against the entire state and nation when it comes to its legal system. So he was not, exactly comfortable with that. But if it wasn't for Judge Waring, who convinced him that that was what needed to happen, to challenge the very core of the problem, and that is that segregation per se is unconstitutional and should be challenged. Judge Waring stands tall in this whole story and should not, again, a South Carolinian in a South Carolina case. And in fact, the South Carolina case is the only case that Thurgood Marshall actually argued in court. He didn't argue in court the Brown case in Topeka. It was the South Carolina case that started this whole litigation movement.
So we find ourselves here, right? 2022, 3 individuals, proud members of the Call Me Mr. program, an inaugural member of the first cohort, executive director, and program manager, 22 years into this thing. And can you help encapsulate what the role of Clemson University and connect Clemson's university role in bringing this case to light, as well as starting the transformational Call Me Mr. program, one of the premier programs for producing African-American male teachers in the nation? How the role of Clemson University in all of this and why that is so critical?
It's extraordinary to me because a lot of, we know in our 22 years, we've always got the question is, call me Mr. Black males, teaching, education, why Clemson? And we've always responded, why not Clemson? Clemson University is a state-supported land grant institution dedicated to public service. Clemson University is the only university in this state that has its, as we call it, the paw print in every county in this state. Its reach is extraordinary, and its commitment to public service as a land grant is profound, and will never change. It's not a private institution. It is committed to the development, the transformational development of the citizenry of South Carolina. That's important to understand, the overall mission of Clemson University. Within that mission is Call Me Mr., launched out of this space 20 years ago, in partnership with originally 3 historically Black colleges and universities in South Carolina. At that time, Claflin University, Benedict College, Morris College were the 3 original partners in partnership, recognizing that to address this mission, to address this goal, to increase the number of primarily African American males to become teachers at the elementary, early child, middle grade level, was going to take a partnership, because that wasn't where the Clemson University found its success. So, but the HBCUs did have success. Enter Claflin, enter Mr. Mark Joseph, who was part of that first class and back in 2000. But the collaboration of Clemson with the HBCUs, the leadership among the presidents of all the institutions held fast to say that, this is a mission that we're obligated, really, and should be responsible for leading. And that attitude, that vision, that commitment that was launched 22 years ago has remained firm as we sit today. So what does it mean?
It also kind of reminds me of the example you provided about Judge Waring. The Briggs v. Elliott case was able to move forward with the assistance and the relationship by the judge. And what we look at and find our program in 1998 and leading into 2000, there was a scenario in terms of public education was facing. We needed a partner. We needed relationships. Clemson University was very instrumental in stepping up to the plate and addressing the need that South Carolina was facing. The same way we hear about Delane stepping up to the plate to address the need that was taking place in the 40s in South Carolina in public education. That's what Clemson University has done. They stepped up to the plate, forged a relationship, and started all these partnerships and established what we know as the Call Me Mr. program. We see the success, but we clearly know and understand that we don't have the success without the commitment, without the vision of the university, and the many supporters. We don't see the success of, as we know of this Briggs v. Elliott, the rollout of this information and the historical aspects had it not been for the relationships that Dr. Jones have been able to forge, with the library, in the archives, Cecil Williams, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about being in a position to really progress, to move things forward, we talk about the importance and the necessity of relationships. That's really been the essence of really what our program has been about from day one. Everyone playing their role and playing their part and staying in their lane, but working together to improve the conditions, the educational outcomes and experiences of all those intertwined. And so that's been the beauty of Clemson University's commitment to call me Mr., to Briggs versus Elliott, and really to provide a space and an opportunity to allow all these stories to be untold.
And that's tremendous. And what was the need then? The need was to address the teacher shortage. What is the need, fast forward 22 years? To address the teacher shortage. We have remained not only relevant, but we've stayed the course. And I believe that when the case came up, Clemson University was a segregated institution. It was not possible for young people coming out of Clarendon, black kids coming out of Clarendon, to enter Clemson University. Fast forward in 2022, not only is it possible, but we are making an effort to identify and provide support for students coming out of Clarendon County, where Reverend Delane is from, out of Fairfield County, where Maddie Delane is from, his wife, at Clemson University. And the beauty of the Reverity Wells example, to have Reverity Wells, who was denied part of his sacrifice, admission to a college because the punishment was that they falsified his transcript so that he would not get into college, and he did not follow his dream to become a doctor. 2022, we have Reverity Wells' grandson. Reverity Wells' grandson, an applicant, a candidate for admission to Clemson University. That is a powerful thing. And it tells me that the prayers, the sacrifice, the commitment, the dedication, the vision of 75 years ago is being realized today, so that all those prayers are being answered as we sit. And we've had the privilege, the example, the benefit of being on that cutting edge, Mr. Holden, of leading this program and facilitating the journey for so many that will come after us. To give back to the state of South Carolina in education that it so sorely needs and has always needed. That's what's profound. And to know that our misters, that 85% of them since 2000 are still serving in our public schools in South Carolina, and leading, another 12% leading as principals and assistant principals and teacher education programs, giving back to South Carolina. I think that is just, it's a prayer answered. And
so it's interesting. So we, listening to these stories, we see the vehicle of change in our country is found through education.
Absolutely.
It's found through education. The vehicle of change is travels through education. And so that's why our role and what we do, what we find ourselves committing to, education and creating experiences to where young men in South Carolina, young individuals in South Carolina, to receive an education and to go into our public schools to become educators, to create transformational change in our communities, in our schools, and throughout, all throughout, with the understanding of establishing those relationships through that vehicle.
Back into our public schools that many see as a burning house. So in 2022, we're asking 22-year-olds to be like first responders, to run into the burning house, because that's where the need is. and to be prepared to make that change. There's no greater sacrifice. Education has always been a central focus and issue within our communities, and it's not stopped. So, sacrifice, it's almost comical that we think of sacrifice in 2022 when I look at, the sacrifice of the communities that were made in 1940. It's just, it's no comparison. Knowing that history helps us understand that our job is not to run from the problem. Our job is to solve the problem. And that really is what Call Me Mr. has stood for 22 years.
We've always modeled what we expect. We model it for the misters, not because it is expedient, not because it's easy, but because it's right. And I think that's what Clemson University did. They didn't start Call Me Mr. here at Clemson University because it was expedient. It wasn't started because it was easy. It was started because it was right, and certainly has its roots right there in Clarendon County, in understanding that we have a role to play. And now it is very much a collective role. As a proud alumnus of this university, one of the things I take the most pride in is the fact that Clemson University is the one that started Call Me Mr. Why Clemson? Because it's Clemson. Right. That's why Clemson.